We've had a weird road. It used to be that everything that was imperial, and you had a British system, a French system, a Japanese system, and those systems fought over colonies or access and trade lanes. That brought us World War II. But at the end of the war, the Americans drew their allies together and said, we're going to try something a bit different. Instead of everyone having to fight for everything, we're going to use our Navy to patrol the global oceans so that anyone can go anywhere at any time and interface with any partner and access any raw material or market or supply chain. There's just one catch. You must be on our side. We bribed up an alliance to fight the Cold War, and we know this as globalization. This is what brought us global finance and manufacturing and energy and the rest. And that has changed the way we live. Because when people got the opportunity to industrialize and globalize, we urbanized. We moved off the farm to take those manufacturing and services jobs. And when you live on a farm, kids are free labor, so you have a whole bunch of them. You play that forward 70 years, and it's not that we're running out of children. That happened 40 years ago. We're now running out of adults. And it is impossible to run a modern economy without a consumption base and a worker base. And we've always known we were going to hit this point in this decade. Certain things have been able to speed up the process a little bit. COVID is absolutely near the top of that list because all of a sudden everyone saw a health reason to reshore a lot of the supply chain. So we got a kind of a jump start on reshoring and breaking up the globalized system of supply that we've become used to. The leadership of the United States, the willingness of the American political system to kind of hold up the civilizational ceiling and keep the world safe for transport, that's gone. And as we're seeing with the Ukraine war, as countries try to take advantage of this for their own reasons, it leads to more and more disruption. Countries are trying to carve out little bits of this for themselves. The problem that they're going to discover is that a lot of the countries that Americans think of as problematic, Russia, China, Iran, they're actually more dependent upon globalization than most of the countries we like. They're dependent upon access to foreign markets to sell their wares or their energy or to purchase products that they can't make themselves. It's not that I'm going rah, rah America here. The United States never globalized because globalization was a bribe. If we had globalized, we would have just been another empire, and very few countries would have had reason to make common cause with us. And so we allowed our manufacturing base to be somewhat hollowed out, which means that when globalization goes away, we don't suffer nearly as many as most of the countries out there. Before globalization, you could only have something if you could make it within your own network. If you didn't have oil, you didn't have transport. If you didn't have fertilizer, your food production was incredibly low and you had a very light population. If you didn't have iron ore, you weren't going to have steel, so you weren't going to have railways. Globalization allowed everyone to take what they had or what they could be good at and trade that for something else. And that created global trade in the form that we now recognize. There's two paths here. One is to use state policies to lower the cost for being young parents. I'd say Sweden has been partially successful. The downside is that the policy is in Sweden. For your first kid, you get 9 months maternity leave. For your second kid, you get, I believe it's 15 now, and it goes up with each kid. What they discovered with that policy is if you were a woman and you were under 30, no one would ever hire you because you could show up for your first day a week of work, get hired, say that you're pregnant, and they wouldn't see you for 6 years. And you had to pay them. So we got this weird sex dynamic in the workforce that was not healthy at all. The other way to do it is just to have a system that naturally keeps the cost of living low. So cheap land, cheap electricity, cheap housing, cheap finance, cheap food. There are very few countries that have been able to do that at scale. The two at the very top of the list are the United States and New Zealand. But if you look historically, going back the last 60 years, the cost of living per person in New Zealand is among the lowest in the advanced world, right there with the United States. Will this evolve in time? Of course, we're changing the rules of the game. Of course, things are going to be different. But that has meant that New Zealand and the United States have had the highest birth rates in the advanced world for 50 straight years. Consider American-led capitalism or European democratic socialism or fascism. These are all different methods for managing economic systems, for regulating supply and demand, labor and investment. But every single one of them is predicated on something that has been true since the dawn of recorded history. Populations get bigger. Not at the same rate, not the same every year, but the pie always increases. So it's about divvying up a larger and larger resource. That's not the world we're in anymore. The advanced world's population has already peaked. In the case of Germany and Japan, it's been declining for quite some time. And for most of the rest of the advanced world, it will pass the peak this decade. The pie's not getting bigger anymore. We need a different economic model. And if you look at our history, look at the last 10 major wars, including the world wars, but not limited to that. At their core, it's about geography, it's about resource access, and it's about economic theory and how you apply it. All of a sudden, that last part that we've struggled over for centuries, we have to figure out again. And we are not going to get it right on the first try. And we're certainly not going to get it right this decade. The Han ethnicity has been the dominant population block of the territory we recognize as China today for 3,500 years, but they've only actually been in charge of China for about 75 of those years, most of which is under the American-led globalized order. So the idea that China is even remotely capable of playing the long game is historically just kind of funny. More important factor is that we're going to see the end of the Chinese system this decade. And I don't mean the end of the Communist Party, I mean the end of central governance in China. The issue is that the Chinese came late to globalization. They didn't really start the process of industrialization broad scale until the late 1980s, early 1990s. And when you start the process later, you're able to learn from the people who came before. So it took the Brits 7 generations to industrialize. It only took the Germans 4. It only took the Koreans 3. It only took the Chinese 1. And that sounds great, and it generates some of the fastest economic growth in human history. However, it means they compressed the entire process into 4 decades. That sounds great, and they went from pre-industrial poverty to kind of this, I don't want to call it post-consumer, but definitely a highly advanced system very, very quickly. But that means they also made the demographic transition very quickly, going from pre-industrial rice paddy subsistence farming to living in high-rise condos in a single generation. So they went from having 6 and 7 children per woman back in 1970s to 1.1 today, which means that the Chinese population is already in collapse. And with the new data that has come out actually since the book published, we now know that there's going to be less than 650 million Chinese by 2050. And that means we're facing a complete economic collapse this decade, because by the time we get to 2030, there will actually be far more retirees in China than there are working age people, and no children to speak of to generate the next generation at all. Yeah, Shanghai and Beijing have the lowest birth rate of any metro region in any era in any country in history. And we now have the Chinese officials publicly discussing, not happy about it, but discussing that they actually overcounted their population by 100 million people. And all of those people would have been born since the one-child policy was developed, so age 40 and under. And then most of those were women. They aged past the point of being able to repopulate probably 15 years ago, and their population probably actually peaked around 2005. Most Chinese now live in efficiency apartments. There's just no room.
Wow.
Well, I expect we'll have a series of regional powers that are, if not immune, heavily resistant to the trends that I've identified. The United States and New Zealand are not the only countries that have been able to maintain a reasonable birth rate. France and Turkey both make that list. So if your population is stable and you have a military that is kind of right-sized to your needs, and the resources you need are relatively close at hand, so you can get them yourself as opposed to having to depend on a global system that's breaking down, you can do pretty well. So France and Western Europe, Turkey and the Eastern Mediterranean, I would have put Japan in that category, but while I was writing the book, the Japanese and the Americans, first under Trump and then under Biden, basically cut a deal to get along over the long term. That makes the Japanese the only country that has successfully cut a long-term deal with both sides of the American political spectrum. So I now kind of consider Japan and the United States partners in the future, which for your part of the world is brilliant, because the last thing you would have wanted was the Americans and the Japanese duking it out in Southeast Asia again. New Zealand sells to dairy to the Western Hemisphere, let me rephrase that, to North America, are not going to ever be great because it's a protected market. But you've got Southeast Asia right there, which broadly speaking is self-sufficient in basic foodstuffs and energy and raw materials. But if they're going to grow, they're going to need more of all of it. And that's where you and the Australians come into play in a very, very big way. Australasia will have the option of repeating what they've done with fueling the Chinese rise with a bunch of countries that are closer, that are not nearly as politically persnickety, that don't try to take over other people's cultures or dominate their policies, and honestly are on a far more sustainable growth path than anything the Chinese were ever able to muster. There will be challenges. I think energy is probably going to be the biggest one for New Zealand, because you're going to have to get your petroleum from somewhere, and the Middle East is going to be as dicey as it's ever been, especially with the United States no longer there. A lot of these regional powers are going to have to try to get there themselves to get the energy, and the United States just doesn't care. That means for the Kiwis, you either need to find another source of energy or do what the Japanese have done and find a way to cut a deal long-term with the Americans. Your land is perfect and your climate is perfect to grow almost whatever you want to do. So the reason you've shifted in the direction that you have is because in a globalized system, you're able to get top dollar for it. I do see that dialing back somewhat. But don't overplay that, because you've got Australia right next door. So the cereals question, that's where you're least competitive. You can buy that from the Aussies and sell them the things that they're not good at. So I have very high confidence that the disruptions to your system outside of the energy sector are likely to be manageable. Climate change gets tricky because, well, our math isn't that good yet. We know that the climate is warming. We know on average the path that we're on, and it's not great, but trying to figure out what it means for the specific postcode, that is just beyond our capacity. The best example I can give you is right here in the United States. Last summer, we had a heat dome form in the American Northwest, which is usually the chilliest part of the country and has very few days that are above 30 degrees centigrade ever. That heat dome settled over Portland, which is the chilliest and rainiest and cloudiest of our metro zones. And we hit not just 40, but 45 for 2 weeks straight. I mean, that's warmer than Las Vegas has ever been. No one predicted that. People can predict that the Northern Territories are going to get hot or the American South is going to be hot. But Portland? No. We can make some broad brush statements, and I think it affects agriculture more than everything else put together. But we can't really tell what it's going to do to this or that city, at least not yet. The Russians are trying to plug the access points to their territory. Unfortunately for the Ukrainians, 2 of those access points are on the other side of Ukraine. Also, the Russian demography is the second worst in the world. So if they're going to use military tactics in an attempt to secure a better future for themselves, they always had to do it now. So this always had to happen. It always had to happen about right now. The surprising bit is that even before deglobalization has really kicked in full force, is that the Europeans are taking lead on cutting Russia out of the system. And that sounds great from a moral point of view, but you're removing the world's second largest source of exported crude from the market. At the same time, you're removing the world's largest source of fertilizers from the market. There is no way with those 2 things in the mix that we all make it through this. The breakdown in the fertilizer system, it was going to happen anyway because of the Ukraine war. It's happening much faster. That is by far the thing I'm most concerned about overall. It will take us 20 to 30 years to rebuild the supply systems that we're losing right now. And in the time that we don't have enough fertilizer to grow food for 8 billion people, we won't have 8 billion people any longer.